A short first question to give everybody a chance to get going. So Henry, when do we know that we're in a more stable place? So help me understand. So you outlined the probability, reducing the probability of war. You outlined a number of our objectives. But how do we know when we're really approaching positive? You know, when we're making progress on those objectives.
I'm tempted to say when people like Fukuyama no longer look like science fiction entitled. When I always say, when people say, what should our strategic objective be in Tehran? I say, well, you know, maybe when it's they have open display of alcohol and they're doing, you know, they have really racy shows on TV, and it's okay. In other words, when you feel comfortable there, and they feel comfortable there.
So political criteria.
Yeah, but you need to prevent the end of days to get there. That takes at least a couple of weeks.
I'm going to let you go ahead and call.
Okay.
And you just point.
Wow, questions. I'm not used to this. I guess because he's on the outer edge, we'll put him first.
So one of the big issues with missile defense systems like in mid-course or in terminal are that it's relatively easy and relatively cheap to design countermeasures. Are there countermeasures for boost phase interceptors that would make it hard to use them either like operationally or as like leverage for NPEC?
You got to have some really good air defense, and it's got to be sportier than the kinds we even have. You have to be able to shoot something that's small, it's loitering, and it is in international airspace. Have a nice day. You go first, active war. Oh, we don't have to worry about the little lady. We then have cause belli. So for the moment, it's not a bad deal. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, now we'll go to the opposite. The middle gets penalized here. Go ahead.
Oh, me?
Yeah, you.
I guess straying away from the missile side of things, but keeping in the Bolsteresque vein of developing civilian technologies that eventually become militarized. How much of a threat would you say that, say, Chinese economic investment in developing nations as maybe a form of hedging may be for, I guess, the same things along the line of these security issues, and also a point on kind of multilateral agreements and the fact that our administration doesn't seem to have such a great track record of upholding those. Do you think that some kind of multilateral agreement would be possible with full legitimacy, I guess, given to the U.S. that they might stick to it?
All right, just a cautionary note. I wouldn't drag Albert Wohlstetter into the first question. I'm not sure he really gave it the office on your point, but it's a worthwhile point separate from dragging his name in. It's fun to think that someone thinks that using his name will adorn a question, because he wasn't universally loved, you know. You need to read up about his biography. In any case, by the way, you know how he got enemies? He took his subject seriously. You get penalized for that. I'm serious. He paid a price. That's another reason why we need you. We're not looking for people just to climb over one another and get ahead. We need people who are so interested in what matters, they will tell people what it is. In answer to your question, the first thing with economics, I don't know enough about China and the various efforts they have to speak with expertise. But I have listened to people who are expert, and some of them say the following. The biggest problem China faces is they have no friends. And you can't buy friends. You can't. You can rent them, but you can't buy them. And they are trying, as the Middle Kingdom, to buy tribute. It's It's not clear economically, they know what they're doing or they can. Emotionally, I think there's trouble there. So it could be that it's to our advantage that they're knocking themselves out, going away from the Western Pacific into this hopeless area of doom and gloom and dysfunction called Central Asia. I mean, how well are we doing in Afghanistan? How well did the British do? I mean, okay, have at it, be my guest. So that's point one. So I don't know how that breaks. I'm giving you a very different kind of answer than, yes, you're absolutely right. You might not be, but you might be, I don't know. But there are two stories there, and you want to kind of wrestle with the other one. With regard to multilateral things and agreements, let me just say one thing. Ideas have a power separate from success. And what I mean by that is if you can get many people to agree with you, you can debate and hold your ground, even if you don't win over every heart and mind. Treaties are the icing on the cake of that dispute. You don't always get the icing, but getting the cake matters. If you can get your allies to say, yeah, they're right, and if you can get neutral parties to say, you know, that makes some sense, it has a potency whether you have an agreement or not. For many years, there were norms against the slave trade. There wasn't an international treaty against it. Thank God there was a norm. So we need to be willing to step up to the things less than the things that appear as coonskins on diplomats' walls. We may have that as a goal, and we should try for that. But we shouldn't poo-poo things that fall short of that. Frequently, things that initially are controversial and do not have universal support eventually get there. And along the way, it matters plenty who's willing to raise their hand and say, that's right. You study the slave trade and how that unfolded, you'll definitely understand what I'm talking about. Because we did not have treaties for a long time, but thank God certain countries finally got out of that. And it helped, because they started enforcing it even without universal treaties. Okay. Did I answer both questions? Okay. Okay, you've been patient, and then you've been very patient.
So I have two questions. One is like, why are you not considering like cyber weapons?
I'm sorry.
Why are you not considering cyber weapons?
Oh, because everyone's talking about that so much they don't even know what it means. And it's very hard to regulate something that you don't quite understand yet. It's very important. But I always say, you don't go for targets that you can't pin down first. So I'm all for study and work in that area. I'm not sure we understand that quite well. It's a little bit, it is, to say something totally politically incorrect at great risk, it is to the military scientific world what global warming theories are for energy economics. There's a connection, but we don't know what it is and what it should be. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the second question is
Yeah.
like, how do you put in place like new treaties when you are alienating your allies by calling them competitors and using the same word to describe Russia and China? So in terms of like how you're putting them together, they're all in the same bag. So how you put in place like INF?
Stop all your head. I'm going to tell you some personal advice, and I'm going to tell you the answer. Two of my closest friends today who have supported me, not just morally and over the phone, but with money, were my arch enemies. If you're lucky enough to have somebody hate your guts, stay in touch. Mostly people ignore one another. But if somebody is coming after you, they're paying attention. They think you matter. You better stay in touch. You never know. Because as soon as they say say something that you agree with, you need to rush to them immediately and say, I know we hate each other, but that was really good. And when that moment comes, things change. So that's just some personal advice for all of you. It's worked for me, I think it'll work for you. Now, getting to the bigger point. I think it's very hard, as the Chinese say, to have diplomacy without the threat of force. So I don't think right out of the box you want to dismiss getting someone's attention by threatening them. As for, I think, the gist of what we're all thinking by the question, you need to be thinking about this not because of who currently is running the country, but because we don't know who may run the country in the future. You better have things that make sense, not only for whoever is running the country now, but also will make sense if there's someone with very different outlooks. I'm trying to find the home. This is as good as I can get. What I'm looking for now are people who are respected by the Pentagon, who are not clearly identifiable in the two kooky groups that I have the cartoons for. And I'm hoping I can suck people in on the sizzle of this new steak. I don't know if I'll succeed. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So you touched on this a little bit, I think, with talking about how conventional weapons have kind of become so effective, or missiles have become so effective that conventional weapons can be used in place of like nuclear ones.
Yeah.
There's always rumors going around about like miniaturization of nuclear weapons.
Right.
And particularly how like there's potential for them to push the boundaries of, say, a smaller country that like wants to use force uses one of these weapons to see if other countries will actually respond in a nuclear fashion or push that boundary.
Yeah.
How does like a miniaturized nuclear weapon or even arms control for that fit into this broader picture?
Haven't thought too much about it, so let me give you a complete answer. Spray voltage, they call this loose change. First thought, you don't have to speculate on mini nukes. We had in our arsenal something called the Honest John, 10 kilotons. Oh, excuse me, 10 tons. Did I get that right? Yes, I believe it was 10 tons. It was roughly a little bit bigger than the Grand Slam, which was the biggest conventional weapon we used. It weighed, it was not 10 tons, but some fraction of it. It was at least, I think, roughly 5 tons. So 10 tons. The Russians have things that range. We have things that in volumetrics that come close to that number as well. So wow, it gets great. I think so that's the first observation. It's not an answer, but just make you smarter on your own question. The second observation might begin to answer your question, and that is when you use these things, you want to know how the story might end. And it's all good and well to deploy these things and even threaten to use them, but what you need to try to figure out, well, how does this end? Now, you can look up on Google something called Operation Carte Blanche. It was an exercise in '55. And it was sort of like a My incident, yes. We had to destroy the village to save it. We had to destroy Europe to defend it. And it was sort of like, oh my God, I guess we need a plan B. If use begets more use, it could end so badly you wouldn't start. This argues for you don't want any more folks getting their fingers on triggers. And it would be nice if you had fewer. And if there were fewer of them, on balance, it'd probably be better too. I think this is what animated Albert Wohlstetter and his enthusiasm for tackling what currently I charitably describe as my portfolio, crappy arms control, which is non-proliferation. I think it's a geopolitically super important field that is treated as if it's some kind of arcane, specialized thing that you do in international capitals over, really fattening food. It's not. you're talking about alliance relations, having defense plans that don't depend on the use of these things, feeling comfortable in countries so that they trust you and you trust them. It's really not just for breakfast. It's for every meal. It is a strategic narrative of a comprehensive character to do non-proliferation intelligently. It is not yet treated that way. My hope and my endeavor is to make the case that it should be, and I publish a lot in hopes that someone will get it. Some do, but not enough.
I'd like to ask maybe about a fifth point.
Yeah.
So you've got 4 points, and you touched on.
I have 4. You can
Well,
count what are.
well, that's what I have with the
Send me
diplomatic
the
evidence.
outline.
Yeah.
I'll have to restructure this.
But I want to zero in on what I think is probably the most destabilizing aspect of all of the current major nuclear arsenals, which is fixed land-based missiles. We know that Britain isn't even interested in building fixed land-based missiles or land-based missiles of, nuclear tipped of any kind. France deactivated theirs.
Right.
We and the Russians have been deactivating ours. The Chinese have actually started to go in the business of mobile land-based missiles. So so they're not, they used to be in the
Right.
fixed land-based business,
Right.
but they're not.
Now there's a question here.
Well, the question really is, why not focus on a new treaty, which could be augment the NPT, but just focus on abolishing fixed land-based missiles, an agreement that these are actually just more destabilizing than stabilizing in a
Yeah.
world of increasing conventional
Now,
precision
is this a
counterforce.
question or a fundamental endorsement of everyone opening their wallet and giving me more money?
Let's hope for both.
They don't-
I'm certainly
I don't-
not opposed to
Maybe
well-following wisdom.
maybe a slice of pizza instead. How do I get this thing off of here?
I don't know. Stuart? can you-
Remind me later.
Yeah, can I ask Stuart
No,
to
no.
jump over?
No, I think we got it.
Oh, you
Okay.
got it? Okay.
What part of that isn't the exact same thing?
It's the concept, I guess what I'm thinking here, well, let's just talk
No, no,
about it a
no,
little
no.
more fully. So what I mean is that we, think about not, so you've been pairing things, your diplomacy was pairing various, sort of preparing various, issues, in space, issues with, North Korea,
Right.
with Iran.
This
And-
is-
and I was thinking,
yeah.
and I'm just
No.
thinking a little more, and maybe it is the same.
I was just gonna say, you gotta, one of the hardest things for people, like ourselves, is to take yes for an answer. And,
I'll take it.
don't, when someone says something, that you agree with, the brilliant thing to do is to thank them. You should thank me, because
Okay.
this is the exact same idea. What you're doing is, there was a piece called Missiles for Peace, okay? Take a look at it. It's a long time ago. It was about 8 years ago, based on stuff that I published 9 years ago. This is Moldova. And what I said is, we could convert all of our fixed-based missiles from nuclear to, Al Ladder's, he called them rods from God, Falcon. It's a system where you put really strong steel, tungsten rods, and it kinetically takes care of what you used to destroy with nuclear warheads, which is sort of a crude version of a hypersonic missile. And I said, you do that, and the Chinese and Russians will freak out and say, well, we prefer not to do this too. Would you like to come and inspect them to make sure that we don't launch them preemptively? And we could go further. How about if we all just get rid of our ground launch fixed stuff? And while we're at it, maybe we should talk about the mobile stuff too. Point is that, as the Chinese say, diplomacy without the threat of force is not even laughable. It's ridiculous. I think the ground launch missiles are what Reagan called nuclear missiles, roughly, is an interesting proposition, and the fixed siloed ones deserve massaging. I know a lot of my friends like the idea of, they call it missile sinks or sponges. I think the people I studied under, Harry Rowan, Albert Wohlstetter, at a minimum, and I talked with them before they died about this, were not on board. They were of the view that we needed to either go mobile or just get rid of the land-based thing altogether, start thinking about that.
Mm.
So we're not there yet. I think this discussion is pretty ideological. I think we'd have a hard time politically persuading the folks that are in favor of these things to think about that. But it's worth talking about and thinking through, because I think there's a lot of vulnerability to these systems that you really want to eliminate. I would start with the proposition that we should denuclearize them at a minimum, make them conventional.
Mm.
And of course, this sends everyone into infinite, anxiety attack. But my read is have them sit in the command centers with us. I don't really care. Of course, we'd have to sit in theirs too. Worth talking about. I mean, I'm being very playful here, but I'm agreeing with you.
Yes, and just to add, and I know you know this, but I'm pretty sure most people here don't know. So Wohlstetter, one of his most important ideas came in the 1950s when he was at RAND during a study he did called the basing study, which was a study that showed that keeping our medium bomber bases, especially in Europe, was actually destabilizing, because they were the targets of what would become preemptive strikes, and that we should get rid of our bomber bases, essentially the medium bomber bases anyway, and go heavily into missiles. And this is the 1959 article that we read in class, and now that at the time challenged the military, because all the generals in the Air Force were bomber generals from World War II. So when we talk about putting yourself at odds with the military, he was right. It was, and that's why RAND became basically defanged. So RAND since has never had that power to be able to challenge the military generals the way Wohlstetter was able to in the 1950s.
I have a very different read of history.
Then let's hear it.
No, that's not how I think it unfolded. First of all, his first recommendation was to move the strategic bombing force from medium range to strategic range and just move the bases, first of all, to CONUS. He then suggested as the next step that, and Curtis LeMay actually did that.
Yep.
Okay, so there wasn't this, there was this on that. He then argued that you wanted to have shelters for the B-52s. Now, that was a hard sell and did not go down. There was enthusiasm on all sides. Let's get missiles. I don't think the Air Force was all that upset with that idea. In fact, they wanted 10,000 of them. Does anybody know how many we deployed? Oh, these are little factoids that matter. 1,000.
Yeah, that's about it.
That's like an order of magnitude. In politics, that number matters. If it's an order of magnitude, it's sort of like, wait a minute, that's interesting. Why did we go to that? It's because Rand did some studies, as did Albert, on how hard you could make concrete. And what they discovered is people who said, oh, you can't make a hardened shelter for the bomber, were also saying you couldn't make a hardened silo. Well, they started pouring concrete and talking to engineers. That turned out to be dead wrong. That's the reason why Phyllis Schlafly and others who wanted 10,000 weapons literally parked out in, I don't know, parking lots, I don't know where, lost. And it was a suggestion that saved money. Oh, wait a minute, where we go? Where's that criteria? Where's Mr. Schelling?
Yeah,
That's what's known as an example. It made it very hard to know. When you have the missile outside, you have to worry that it might be launched at any time. And you can see some indications of launch preparation. If it's in a silo, you can't. So false signaling goes down. The cost of maintaining the system, moreover, goes down. And because they had fixed locations, it helped a little on the accuracy. And, you know, with time, it got much better, and not having to move around makes it easier to know where you're starting, you know. That said, I think it could be that nonetheless your interpretation's correct, that no one likes being corrected.
I think I'll say thank you.
Yeah. You know, that.
That's the answer, right?
Yeah, but how shall I put it? History helps. You can't read too much of it. And I'm not sure that I've mastered all of this at all, so I don't want to be pulling rank here. Yeah.
So I really like your comment about how what we need to do as academics is think about the things that other people aren't thinking about, right? And
Well,
so-
but you don't want to have that as the only criteria.
Well, no.
There are a lot of things people aren't thinking about, and I don't recommend that you
When the
get into the
aliens come,
business.
right? Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, that's not the only criteria.
Yeah. But, no, so, on that note, and this is something I think people are thinking of, but they wish they weren't thinking about it, which is, what would happen from a proliferation standpoint in Europe? I'd really love to hear your opinion on this. If the US did either fully withdraw from NATO, or pull a France Charles de Gaulle and just say we are out of the military component of it. We're still gonna be signatories to the treaty,
Yeah.
we're still gonna show up at the summit, but we are no longer part of the military command. What would
Yeah.
happen in Europe
Right.
from a proliferation standpoint?
I have a young scholar who I smile upon because, like myself, he has, I'd like to think, a junior version when I get. There is a degree that's much higher than the ones you have here. Does anybody know what it is? It's not the PhD, it's much higher. It takes much longer. In fact, it's a degree that you get if you can figure out you got it. And it's very hard to know if you have. Does anybody now know what it is?
You told me, so I know the answer.
It's an ABD, an all but dissertation. I have one. I was here 8 years. Studied constitutional law for 4. Spent 4 years on my master's. Was then told I had made a terrible mistake. It wasn't my master's, it was my PhD. And I said, can we dispense with the niceties? And he said, no, and that's the problem. That's when I left. So, in answer to your question, you're asking, again, something about alliances. This young scholar went to Harvard for 2 years and actually came to his senses in my book and said, I don't want to be a part of this, after working very closely with very senior people after 2 years. And he said, you know, I want to work in the government. I want to do public service. He's writing a book on what happens when allies get nuclear weapons, or friends. And the reason he's writing it is to try to answer your question. What would happen? What did we learn from France, Britain, Pakistan, and Israel getting these things? Did it make our job of defending ourselves cheaper? Did it make our alliance relations easier? Or not, and why not? And I think the short answer to your question is, it won't help. Now, I don't know that the American Constitution has a requirement that we stay in certain places for forever. So, at some level, I'm sympathetic to that, but there's a time and place, and maybe in some kind of perverse way, Mr. Trump's helping us get to that point sooner. But you gotta know what you're suing for, and I think we wanna be as clear about that as we're complaining about what we're not getting. And if we are, you know, a little coercion, you know, doesn't hurt. I remember back in the 80s, I believe, Andy Marshall asked, well, what are our allies really spending on defense? And everyone's, oh, well, they're, you know, the NATO office, oh, they're doing great, you know, and it was one of these things, well, okay, you say they're giving X%. What is the value of the underground economy in Southern Europe? Well, it's about 100% of what the declared value of the economy is. Oh my, they're not spending so much. But again, what should we be spending on? What is it that would bring us to a higher comfort zone, and for them a higher comfort zone? What are the threats? You want to have clarity about that as much as you want that, hey, we want you to do more. If you do both, it might make sense to eventually not have so many. You'll notice we have many fewer than we used to.
So I want to bring us to a close by saying that for myself personally, one of the most important legacies when I read across Wohlstetter's set of work is consistently he was thinking about, as you called it, economic and technological trends, and how we should think about that for our security going forward. Henry, I think that's what you're doing for us today more than anything else. You're talking a lot about the current trends. You're thinking in depth about very precise ways in which we should be thinking about how they connect to these three goals. I would say especially the first goal, and I think that that really nicely really captures something that Wohlstetter has left us with, and I want to thank you very much for doing that for us today.
Well, I got to remind you, I don't think I was one of his better students. He did, and Roberta joined my board, and I got to know him, thankfully, despite my career here. He left before I even could get done, which was somewhat tragic. But we made up for it before he died, and certainly there was an intervening period of about a decade or so that I got the annoying phone calls from him. You know, so those are priceless. In any case, I think one can do better at this. I think trying to think about technical trends that make more choices possible in areas that seem inevitably driven in one direction, bad or not, really need to be recognized, and I think that's something that both of the Wohlstetters were very much about, including many other things. But I'd have to say this is, how shall I put it, a faint representation of that, I suppose.
Well, thank you for giving us the case.
There are books here for those that love hard copy, and I